like to ask about incest and sex with children.
Yep.
And where does the law of attraction play a role here? Because with the other sexual practices that we're talking about, except sex with the dead and animals, where maybe there's no consent, we're talking about consent between adults mostly. But with children, I can't understand how does a child attract that?
A child attracts those kind of events through the unhealed emotions of its own parents. So it's its own parents in denial of unhealed emotions that attracts the events for the child. And this is the case for all things that children attract. So the reality is there is huge damage in pedophilia and incest. And the reason why there's huge damage in it is because not only does it not state the pure state, but also it actually is it is imposing an adult's will upon an undeveloped soul, a person who's yet to have the development of knowing what is, the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do, and it imposes upon them without their consent. And any time you impose something upon an adult without their consent, you are breaking laws of free will. But if you're imposing something upon a child, whether they give consent or not, you are actually breaking a lot of laws about whether the child's developed or not as well. So this is a very damaging action to do, certainly. The key what we want to do, though, is we need to look at not condemning the desire. See, what we've finished up doing is any person who has the desire for incest or desire for paedophilia, we eventually condemn them. Societally, what we do is we condemn them. We're very angry with them, and we do all sorts of things as a result to those particular people. What I'm suggesting is instead of doing that, we need to not condemn the desire, but rather the action is very, very damaging. We need to look at the desire. We need to examine why the desire is present, right? If we don't examine why the desire is present, the action will never change.
The desire will never change.
The desire will never change, and therefore they will want to act upon the desire. So what we want to do is look at the desire, acknowledge whenever it's present, look at the desire and start questioning why it exists.
The reason I wrote that on the board, actually, we were talking about taboo things sexually abhorrent to some people, is because I feel that because there is such shame and judgment of pedophilia, which I do feel is a horrible, abhorrent practice, but because there's so much judgment of people who practice pedophilia, they themselves are never encouraged to examine what the desire covers. And so the statistics for healing of people who practice pedophilia are pretty horrible because they don't really ever... There's very low statistics of people who ever stop having the desire to harm children in that way once they've started that.
This is why they do it over and over and over again until they die. And it's only usually in the spirit world that because of the openness of people assisting them, that they actually begin to address the emotional reason why they did so many terrible acts towards children. And the issue we need to face is not that we're not saying, myself and Mary are not saying that this isn't a major problem. It's a major problem on the earth. But what we're saying is every time we condemn in a person, even it's the reason for it occurring, the desire, we are actually stopping them. Societally, we are stopping them from ever healing their problem. We need to be able to discuss with them what the problem is all about emotionally and help them through the emotion that causes them to have a desire to have sex with children. That's what we need to do instead. And if that means isolating them from children until the desire is healed, then that's what we do. But we need to still go through the process of healing the desire. See, a lot of these different things, are actually caused by unhealed desires, unhealed emotions. They're caused by emotions that are not even related to sex. And actually, some pedophilia-based emotions are not even related to sex. They're related to many other emotions. But we need to be open to seeing the desire and then addressing it and talking about it openly without condemnation and judgment. Because as soon as we judge the person, as soon as we condemn the person, from that moment on, they are unable to heal the emotion. From that moment on, they are going to hold on to the emotion, deny it. They'll even try to make out they don't have it when they still have it. And that's not going to get us anywhere when it comes to healing that sexually.
But in answer to your question, children don't have a law of attraction. It's based on their parents' law of attraction, and also it's based on the harm that individual is causing to do to children. Like they hold the ultimate responsibility for that. And then there's unhealed emotions within both parents that allow that cause the lack of protection, if you like, for that child, for them then to be harmed.
So for many parents, they can't even recognise when their child has been sexually harmed just once. And the reason why they can't recognise it is because they themselves have emotional injuries that prevent the recognition of such harm. The truth is, when the parents are totally open emotionally and totally able to open sexually, they would instantly recognise even the danger before it occurred. They'd recognise the type of person who would be involved in sort of some kind of act of incest, and they would instantly take precaution with that particular person. But for the majority of us as parents, because we have different shames of our own and different histories of our own and so forth, and in particular, and this is why incest happens in a multi-generational sense, in particular, if I have been harmed sexually as a child and I deny this emotion within myself and I grow up to be an adult, there is usually only two particular paths I'm going to take. One path is to become a person who abuses children myself. The other part is to become a person who completely is unaware of any abuse of children, and therefore my child, if I ever have a child, will be totally open to being abused.
They're the two paths while I'm in denial.
While I'm in denial.
Of my own emotions.
The third option, obviously, is for me to heal it sexually, to heal myself sexually, heal the history of my own abuse. And when I heal the history of my own abuse, there is a much higher likelihood of my child never being abused, because I would instantly recognise the type of person who's the abuser rather than being afraid of them and going into my shell and trying to deny that they exist. Does that make sense?
Does that cover your question?
Yeah.
Yep. No, microphone.
Directly to what you just mentioned, we have a lot of cases now in Germany referring to the Roman Catholic Church, that adults go into the open and talk about their sexual injuries they experienced from priests. Yeah. Would that help for the healing process? Of course, there are the priests which are condemned right now and certainly don't look very nice, but the other ones, the victims, are speaking openly about what happened to them. True. I thought it is maybe a way to heal.
Definitely.
What is there underlying in the whole society.
Definitely. The truth is always the thing that leads to healing. Truth. The truth of what actually happened is always what leads to healing. So having victims who of incest able to speak openly and frankly about what's happened to them is a very powerful form of healing for them. They've got to be very careful, though, that they don't get into the cycle of just talking about what's happened without feeling the actual emotions, the underlying emotions about what happened. That's the thing they need to take care of. Yeah. However, on the priest side, while the churches still protect priests from this whole process,
from the consequences of their actions,
the priests themselves cannot heal.
So you said they were condemned, and they are condemned by a lot of society, but they're actually almost condoned, like they're allowed to avoid responsibility for what they've actually done.
Yeah, Mary, this is right.
Of the church.
And the other thing is, that's what AJ said, they have no chance to heal because they are building up a block to hide beside, because I think they're full of shame and they must have reasons for that.
Well, no, many of them are just full of rage initially and then other emotions. But while they're not isolated, placed in some kind of psychotherapy, working through the emotional reasons why they chose to harm children, while all of that's happening and that's not happening, then those priests and ministers have no chance to heal their problem. No chance at all. Now, some of them would be very resistive to that, of course. They'd be very resistive to having any form of that happening. However, in the spirit world, that's what's going to happen to them either way, right? Because the law of attraction in the spirit world works perfectly. And once those ministers get into a state where they acknowledge what they've done, from that moment on, they have a chance to heal. Now, any person who does not acknowledge what they've done needs to then be kept in isolation until they just acknowledge what they've done.
Most of them are retired already. And most of these priests, which have been accused of having done that, are retired or about to be...
But they're not in isolation.
No, they're not in isolation.
Because the reality is many of them have
not
been placed in some kind of isolation where they can no longer harm children. They still they still have the desire in them to harm children, and they're in society where there are children, and yet they're not in isolation. They need to be placed in some form of isolation, but the isolation needs to be non-condemnatory and loving, where it helps them work through the emotional injuries. That's the sole purpose of the isolation. Helps them work through their emotional injuries until such a point as they no longer have the injury. When they no longer have the injury, then they can re-enter society and they'll be safe to be with because they'll actually have a desire for their soulmate rather than a desire to sexually abuse children. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think the people in Germany right now part much more with the victims.
Yes.
And I thought it was a good idea that they come into the open because I think there are so many cases when victims do not speak. And all of a sudden they do speak up after 20 or 30 years.
Yep.
And I was amazed about this like a volcano which is breaking, which is
erupting.
Erupting, exactly. Like things like this are erupting as well, so everything comes into the light.
Yes. The problem with society generally is that we as a society do not want to know about child abuse.
That's right.
We do not want to know or even most of the time accept that it's actually happening. And the reality is it's happening in many families on this planet. You know, at least 1 in 3 families on this planet, in fact. So the reality is there's huge amounts of child abuse on the planet. And because there's so much about it, there are so many guilty people. And the reason why then we don't want to talk about it is because many people who feel guilty don't want to speak about it. And then many of the people who have been abused don't want to speak about it either because they feel ashamed and guilty. They feel like they've been to blame somehow. They don't really understand how, but that's the feeling that's present. And as a result of that, there is a huge amount of suppression of the truth about abuse on the planet. And that's what causes the shutdown of healing it.
May I ask you a very personal question, because I'm a teacher?
Yep.
And I have a lot of kids who are either sexually abused or abused by violence. And sometimes I do not know how to handle it.
Yep.
I give them the chance as often as possible to talk to me.
Yep.
And I tell them have the right for your feelings, not acting it out, which some of them do.
Yep.
But then in the end, I feel very helpless.
Yep.
I don't know what to do, and I was going to ask you, what can I do? Because in my class, I have some cases which are quite serious.
The best thing you can ever do for a child who is being abused is to prevent the abuse.
How can I do that? I cannot go home.
Well, you need
I
report it.
Yes, I report it. We interview the social workers.
Yep.
But then we already experience how limited
Of course.
these institutions are.
Of course.
Because if parents deny and the doctor didn't testify that was an abuse, the abuse will continue.
Of course. And this is where every single person involved in the reporting of it needs to take a good look at their own condition. Why are they in denial of something that's obviously harming a child? And what we need to see as a society is that there is a deep denial that these things are occurring in society. And that's one of the reasons why many people who are in positions of responsibility in society are actually denying their existence. This is also the reason why the Catholic Church, for example, denied the existence of pedophilia within the ranks of the priesthood, because they want to maintain a semblance of order of their society, and they want to deny the truth of what's actually going on in many cases. And what we need to all do is look at our own part in the denial of these truths and our own emotions. So if I've reported a sexual abuse issue to the authorities, and I've done all I can to say something about that and still no action is taken, then I've got to look at emotionally why there is no action being taken. That's part of my law of attraction. That's part of my soul attraction. So I need to go through my own feelings of frustration, my own feelings of anger and rage, my own feelings of anger and rage towards the abuser, my own feelings of sadness about the abuse occurring. And often when I go through those emotions, then the child will actually get looked after. So we need to see everything happening externally as a law of attraction event for something that we need to personally work through. In my own case, when I've ever noticed a child abused, the very first thing I do is give them the opportunity to get out of the family household if they're old enough to do so. Now, in some cases that's meant they've come and stayed in my house for a period of time.
We are not allowed to do that.
I know. Can you see what's the problem? You say you're not allowed to do that. I'm sorry, I can't agree with that at all.
Sorry?
I can't agree.
That we are not allowed to do that?
No, I don't agree that you're not allowed to do it. You've got a fear of authority that causes you to feel are not allowed to do that. Does that make sense?
Not really, but I have to think about it or feel about it.
Yeah.
Right now,
this is why we don't act, because we've got a fear of our own self being harmed in some way if we act in the manner that we feel driven to do. So if I'm very, very sure that a child is being abused, like my feelings are, I want to take very strong action about that. Now, if the society tells me I'm not allowed to, I say, well, blow that. Like, I need to still act, no matter what's going to happen as a result from that society. Do you follow me? Just like I would with any other truth. Like, if I strongly feel that a child is being harmed, then why wouldn't I act even at the risk of my own harm? Can you see that I have an emotion where I'm afraid of my own harm so much that I'm not willing to take the child out of harm? And this is where we need to deal with our emotions. Every person involved with these issues of child abuse.